Good morning. Happy Wednesday. Sorry I can't be there today or Friday. This is my last week of travel, hopefully, for a little while, and we'll get to continue to be together face to face. But I want to keep moving into the Fitch text today and Friday, and so if you didn't bring it with you this morning, would love for you to bring it with you on Friday. I also emailed an outline to you Tuesday evening, and that outline will help you begin to, without me being able to use the PowerPoint or the screen, it'll help you be able to follow along as I talk with you this morning and Friday morning. I want to pick up where I left off. We were talking through the transition from pre-modernity to modernity to post-modernity. And so, again, pre-modernity, we assume that there's an order. We may disagree about what that order is, but the general assumption is that there's an order to things. And so to be good then is to find oneself in the order, to fit and to know where one belongs within the order. Um, Again, as Christianity became the more privileged religion of the state, that was a good system for us because we could then, in Western culture at least, articulate that order. And for the most part, most people within the culture then interpreted their life, interpreted their reality through the order that the church articulated for most of most people, and most people then lived into that, especially again in Western culture. But then, as we shift from modernity, we still have this assumption that there's an order. But now the question is, now that it's been revealed that the Earth is not the center of the universe, that the sun is, and we may be wrong about a lot of the things that we've assumed from Revelation in. Maybe what we need to do now is start in and work out. And so go down to the bottom, go down to the smallest thing that we can know. So that's where we talked about Descartes, foundationalism. Get down the foundation and then build up from there. Still an assumption of order. But what happened then that begins to shift in late modernity is we begin to have masters of suspicion that come along. And the key here that I want you to see is not so much that the masters of suspicion begin to doubt that, for example, gravity works or that the earth will continue to rotate around the sun. But as we threw off all those old stories, and as we began to look at scientifically the way the world works, when we threw off those old stories, we also threw off the ways that we understood how to live our lives. So the example I think I've used with you before is take a junior high health class, for example. In our day, we can tell kids how their bodies work. In fact, we do know in greater detail how their bodies work with regards to the onset of adolescence and how their bodies function sexually and how all of that works. We understand that very well, much better than ancient people would have understood how their bodies function. So, for example, um, it wasn't that long ago that Henry VIII kept finding a new wife because he wanted to have a male heir, and he assumed it was the fault of the woman who kept having female children. Well, now we know it's the male who determines the sex within conception, and so, um, but we understand that very well. But we've thrown off then these older stories that shaped how we thought about our lives, for example, sexually. So we may know more detail about how our bodies work scientifically, but we don't have any stories then to tell what we ought to do and why how we ought to live then sexually. So you go to a modern health class in a public school, we tell students how their bodies work, but we can't tell them now what they ought to do with their bodies. We can say, be careful because we know that oftentimes you can pick up a sexually transmitted disease. You may want to be careful because there are studies that talk about the emotional scarring that oftentimes can happen. We can talk about scientific things, but we can't talk about any kinds of religious convictions or what we might call meta narratives about how we ought to live out our sexuality. So, and the odd thing is, in a culture where those stories have been removed, or at the very best have been privatized. So I may have a story and you may have a story, but that's your story and that's my story. And the essence is that any story is as good as any other story. in that kind of culture, then there is no story. And so what I was trying to get at with Nietzsche is Nietzsche comes along and then says, well, God is dead. See, we've killed this outside story. We've killed this idea of what gave us meaning, what gave us significance, what shaped our understanding of our lives. All of that is gone. We've unchained the earth from the sun. And in one sense, that's really exciting. So now I can do whatever I want to. I can slay the dragon of thou shalt with the sword of I will. I can define my life and my future, my destiny, my sexuality, my material life. I can do that any old way I want to, because anything that you tell me is really just a will for you to power your influence over me. It's a will to power. And so I can just break that. And so it's a very interesting kind of late modern moving into postmodern culture. And so some scholars will say postmodernity then comes along when we realize that the emperor has no clothes. That once we've thrown all of that off, there's nothing left. And that's sort of why I talked about Nietzsche. The Nietzschean impulse that says that now there is no meaning. Everything is just a will to power. But that's a real place of despair, because it means that our lives are not part of any bigger story. They're not part of anything bigger than what we want to write. And so sometimes you can get folks like Nietzsche and others who get hopeful because now we can write the true human story. But you think about, the early 20th century and World War I, World War II, the kind of optimism, the development of nuclear weaponry, all of that led to a kind of despair over, humanism that rose up to say, now we can tell the human story. We can quit telling God's story of humanity. We can now tell our own story, and we can be optimistic about what we can build. And that's where, I think the poets and novelists are really important. That's why we, in most schools, we made you read Lord of the Flies. Because if you put people on an island all by themselves with no story to define the reality, they inevitably move to places of violence and brokenness and tragedy. And all of those kinds of narratives from the early to mid 1900s were an attempt to poke a hole in the optimism of humanism. And certainly World War II, Vietnam, all of those poked a hole in that kind of humanistic optimism. So in postmodernity, you get two options. So on the top of the outline, I give you these options, Nietzsche or Aristotle. So that some of my favorite philosophers, and I'll talk about one in just a moment, Alasdair MacIntyre, argue that then now we have two options. We either have to go to this place of rugged individualism, of throwing off all these narratives and ending up with no story at all, and except the one that we write for ourselves. So Nietzsche is one option, or we can go to what some philosophers have called Aristotle, where we come to realize that we're part of grand traditions. We're part of larger stories. We're part of traditions and histories that do tell us who we are and what we're supposed to do and how our lives are to function and how life finds its meaning. But the problem there for postmodernity is we cannot prove those based on sort of scientific methods. So let's say we want to say Christianity is the grand story that explains why humans exist and how we're to live. The problem is we can't prove Christianity in the ways that things get proved in modernity. We can't put Christianity, Buddhism, Islam, we can't put them all in a line and take our holy books, for example, and light them on fire, and whichever one doesn't burn, that's the one that's true. Or somehow get down to studies of who's happier, or, those kinds of things. All of that gets down to things that are just unquantifiable. So how do you prove the truth of these meta-narratives? How do we prove that we're not a people who live without a story, that there is meaning? Well, all of that comes back to then communities as the witness to a particular way of life. Communities as the argument for the truthfulness of particular meta-narratives or particular traditions. And so that takes me to Alasdair MacIntyre, one of my favorite ethicists. Alasdair MacIntyre taught for a number of years at Notre Dame, is now retired. But MacIntyre wrote a couple of books, one in particular called After Virtue, where he argues that that's the case, that what we have today are we have traditions that are arguing for various truthfulness. And so the first term that I want to give you there is tradition. And let me define it for you. For MacIntyre, a tradition is this: a socially embodied, historically extended argument for certain certain meta narratives and certain truth. Let me try it again. The two key things here are this: that it's socially embodied. A tradition is a socially embodied, historically extended argument for the truthfulness of various existential narratives and truths. So let me stop this for just a moment so it fits, but then I'll come back and pick that idea up. Okay, be with you in a minute.